Serena Brooks had always known that stepping into unfamiliar territory meant more than just navigating new streets. It meant navigating the invisible boundaries drawn by those who ruled the sidewalks with unchecked authority. That afternoon, she drove her sleek black SUV into Glen Rock, a small town so quiet it almost felt suspended in time. The kind of place where faces were familiar, but suspicion clung to strangers like a shadow. She pulled over at the main intersection, the sunlight painting golden streaks across the windshield. Serena wasn't here for leisure. Her role as an internal affairs chief demanded precision, vigilance, and sometimes courage where others faltered. Glancing at her phone's map, she tried to confirm her route. Mind alert but calm. That's when Mark Dalton appeared. He stepped out of his patrol car with the kind of gruffness born from years of policing a town where real crime was rare, but control was everything. His eyes locked onto Serena's vehicle with a sharpness that barely masked disdain. The moment he spoke, the air seemed to thicken. "Your car is parked illegally," Mark said, his voice low but hard-edged. The word "you're" sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Serena turned to face him, her expression steady, eyes unflinching. "I'm just checking the map. If I'm in the wrong spot, I'll move immediately," she replied politely, her tone firm but courteous. But Mark wasn't interested in politeness. He circled the vehicle, peering at the license plate, noting the out-of-state registration like it was a flashing warning sign. "This kind of car. People like you don't usually show up around here," he muttered, laced with something darker than mere suspicion. Serena didn't respond. She had heard this before, thinly veiled accusations born from ignorance and prejudice. Instead, she repeated, her voice unwavering, "I will move if you tell me to." Mark ignored her, reaching for his radio. She caught the clipped phrase, the code for person of interest. The subtle signal meant more than protocol. It was the unspoken invitation to escalate, to assert control over someone deemed an outsider. When Serena tried to return to her car, Mark stepped in front, blocking her path with a deliberate coldness. "You're not cleared to leave," he said, sunglasses sliding onto his face as if to shield himself from the truth reflected in her eyes. "I have the right to leave if there's no lawful reason to detain me," she said calmly, locking her gaze with his. Mark's face tightened. "I'm checking you out because of your out-of-state plates and suspicious behavior. Strangers don't just stop in the middle of an intersection to check a map." The words hung heavy between them, carrying centuries of unspoken bias. A couple walking by paused, the woman tugging her husband's sleeve and muttering, loud enough to be heard. The disdain was clear, another layer of the unwelcoming atmosphere Serena faced. She handed over her license and registration without hesitation. Mark inspected them without acknowledgement, his scrutiny less about legality and more about undermining her presence. "Which neighborhood do you live in?" he asked, his tone dropping into condescension. Serena met the question head-on. "I'm here for work, and I believe I'm not required to share my residence without a stated reason." Mark scoffed, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You seem to know the law." "That's because I understand my rights," she replied, cool and measured. Mark flicked her registration with a finger. "Knowing the law won't help if you don't know where you are. This isn't your city. It's a town where people respect order." Around them, a small crowd had gathered. Their whispers were a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and a silent approval of Mark's assertion of dominance. But Serena stood unbowed, a solitary figure refusing to dissolve into the shadows of expectation. Mark's gaze shifted, eyes flickering over every inch of the car, searching for a justification that did not exist. You smell like a lawyer or one of those women who make life hard for cops. I'm not here to make life hard, Serena said, voice steady. I'm here to ensure justice. Mark's stare was unyielding, a flicker of rage simmering beneath his calm facade. It was a look Serena knew well. A man used to wielding power unchecked, now confronting something he couldn't easily control. The standoff stretched, time bending under the weight of unspoken histories, silent accusations, and the looming threat that this encounter was far from routine. What no one knew yet was how far this confrontation would go, and how the quiet strength of one woman would ripple through a system long in need of reckoning. Mark Dalton's eyes darkened as the minutes stretched on, each second deepening the fissure between law and prejudice. What had begun as a routine stop spiraled into a silent battle of wills, a collision between authority misused and dignity unyielded. Serena Brooks stood her ground, the calm in her posture a stark contrast to the storm brewing behind Mark's gaze. Without warning, Mark's tone shifted from procedural to personal, a barely concealed edge slicing through the polite pretense. You've got out-of-state plates, driving a fancy car, stopping in the middle of the road. That alone raises questions. His words hung in the air, accusations wrapped in the guise of concern, but fueled by something darker. Suspicion bred not from evidence, but from bias. Serena's voice was steady, her composure unwavering. I'm here on official business. There's no lawful reason to detain me. Mark smirked, stepping closer, shrinking the space between them until tension crackled like static. This isn't your town, and around here, strangers don't just park anywhere and act like they belong. I have the right to be here, Serena said firmly, meeting his glare without flinching. I have every right to stop and check my directions. Mark's lips curled into a contemptuous sneer. You lawyers always know your rights, but you forget that respect comes before rights. The words were a slap, a reminder that in Mark's world, respect was reserved for those who bent without question, who swallowed indignities in silence. Serena's jaw tightened. She knew this game all too well. The rules were unspoken. Compliance was demanded, resistance punished. Around them, the crowd had grown. A handful of townsfolk lingered at a cautious distance, faces etched with curiosity and apprehension. Some quietly raised their phones, fingers poised to record. The digital witnesses multiplied, their cameras capturing every breath of tension, every flicker of menace. Mark reached for his radio. Dispatch requesting backup. Subject is non-compliant. Possible obstruction. The call echoed through the still air, an official seal on his escalating grip. No immediate threat justified the call. No flashing lights, no raised voices. But Mark wielded authority like a weapon, eager to assert dominance under the cloak of procedure. Serena's eyes scanned the crowd. The silence was deafening. No one stepped forward. The bystanders' reluctance to intervene was palpable, a reflection of the invisible barrier that kept many tethered to the sidelines, afraid to cross the thin line between witness and participant. Mark blocked her path as she attempted to re-enter her vehicle. You're not free to leave, he said, voice low but sharp, an order disguised as a warning. Serena squared her shoulders, unyielding. You have no legal basis to detain me. I am within my rights. His eyes narrowed, rage simmering beneath the surface. You don't get to decide that. The power imbalance was glaring. Mark's badge gleamed, a symbol that once promised protection, now twisted into a tool of intimidation. His stance radiated control, but beneath the bravado lurked uncertainty. A man clinging to authority in a system that rarely challenged him. Serena's breath remained even, her gaze steady. I am exercising my rights. I will not be intimidated. Frustration flickered across Mark's face. He was a man accustomed to obedience, to the quiet compliance of those he deemed beneath him. Serena's defiance was a challenge he hadn't anticipated. You think standing there with your fancy words makes you untouchable? Mark snarled, stepping closer, his shadow looming. I am not here to be touched, Serena replied, voice calm but resolute. The tension snapped like a frayed wire. Mark's hand twitched near his holster, a silent threat suspended in the charged air. Serena's heart beat steadily. She had faced moments like this before. The knowledge of her rights was her armor, her composure the shield from the crowd. A soft murmur rose. Phones clicked on, cameras focused. The digital gaze had shifted the balance, introducing witnesses beyond the immediate scene. Mark's fury was tempered by the invisible eyes, his moves now under scrutiny. Step back, a voice called out. It was one of the younger officers arriving, his uniform crisp but his demeanor cautious. Mark glared, but the arrival of backup complicated his bravado. The new officers exchanged quick glances, the weight of the moment settling on them. One whispered into his radio, tension etched in every syllable. Serena nodded slightly to the new officers, acknowledgement without relief. The situation had escalated beyond a simple traffic stop. It had become a flashpoint of systemic fault lines, bias, power, and resistance colliding in the middle of a quiet town. Mark's voice dropped into a harsh whisper, barely audible but charged with menace. You're making this difficult. Serena met him without wavering. I'm making this lawful. As more officers gathered, the crowd shifted uneasily. Some watched silently. Others exchanged worried glances. The simmering conflict was no longer just between two individuals. It was a reflection of something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. Mark's hand lingered near his weapon longer than necessary. Serena's pulse quickened, a subtle dance on the edge of confrontation. Yet, her face betrayed none of the storm within. She was calm, poised, unshaken, a pillar amidst the gathering tempest. Enough! A voice barked from the newly arrived senior officer. Let's de-escalate. Mark hesitated, caught between asserting dominance and adhering to command. The arrival of more eyes, more authority, and the invisible presence of cameras forced a fragile truce. Serena took a breath, steadying herself. The battle was far from over, but she had weathered the storm of suspicion and intimidation. For now, the echoes of the encounter rippled beyond the street corners, carried in whispers, captured on screens. A quiet challenge to a system long complicit in silence, and in that charged silence, a single truth crystallized. Power wielded without justice is fragile, and resistance, even in calm silence, holds the strength to shake foundations. Serena Brooks stood motionless amid the mounting tension, her posture unyielding, her eyes fixed on Mark Dalton's narrowing gaze. Every fiber of her being screamed caution, yet her face betrayed none of the fear that could have justified retreat. The crowd around them had grown into a silent, expectant mass, a mosaic of anxious onlookers, some clutching phones, others simply holding their breath. Mark's jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if it might fracture under the pressure of his simmering rage. His knuckles whitened as he balled his fist inside the pocket of his jacket, a barely contained tempest. The law had been his shield, his sword, but now, stripped of reason and restraint, it was reduced to a fragile veneer over something far more primal. You think standing there with that calm makes you untouchable? Mark hissed, his voice low and venomous. Serena met his glare without flinching. I'm not here to be untouchable. I'm here to be lawful. The words hung in the air, heavy and clear, piercing through the charged silence that surrounded them. Mark's eyes flickered, a momentary hesitation, then a spark of something darker. It was a spark born not of logic, but of wounded pride and ingrained prejudice. a desperate assertion of control where none was truly justified. Without warning, Mark lunged forward. His right hand shot out like a striking serpent, closing with brutal force on Serena's left cheek. The impact was deafening in its suddenness. A dull, heavy thud that silenced the murmurs and gasps alike. The punch was caught instantly, cameras and phones capturing every agonizing frame. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. The backward snap of Serena's head, the spray of blood shimmering like rubies against the pale skin, the collective intake of breath from the onlookers. Yet Serena did not collapse. She did not scream. Her body recoiled but remained upright, anchored by an inner strength that defied the violence inflicted upon her. With a slow, deliberate breath, she steadied herself, blood trickling down her cheek in a stark, crimson trail. The street fell into stunned silence. Mark blinked rapidly, as if awakening from a nightmare of his own creation. His hand lingered mid-air, trembled, then dropped, powerless and empty. For the first time in that moment, the fierce armor of his authority cracked, revealing raw vulnerability beneath. The crowd's silence fractured into whispers, a ripple of shock and disbelief washing over them. Did he just punch her? A woman's voice broke through, trembling yet loud enough to be heard. Yes, came the murmured confirmation, an unspoken acknowledgement of a line crossed. A taboo shattered in broad daylight. Serena's lips parted, but she did not cry out. She looked straight ahead, eyes steady and unbroken. In her gaze lay a fierce defiance, not of Mark, but of the system he embodied, a silent refusal to be broken by fists or fear. Mark's breathing grew erratic. The adrenaline coursing through him faltered, replaced by a creeping realization of the consequences now unfolding before him. He was no longer the enforcer, the man in control. He was the aggressor exposed. His actions broadcast and undeniable. He glanced around, searching for support, for a justification, but found none. The cameras bore down on him with unyielding clarity. Witnesses lifted their phones, recording, streaming, immortalizing the moment in digital eternity. A child's voice suddenly pierced the heavy air. He hit the lady. The small boy whispered to his mother, wide-eyed and innocent. The mother's grip tightened around his hand, her eyes darting away as if shielding him from a truth too raw to bear. Mark's face flushed, not with shame, but with the first flickers of panic. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to regain some semblance of control, but no words emerged. The weight of his act pressed upon him like a suffocating fog. Serena wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, then raised her head. Her eyes locked onto Mark's, steady and piercing. "What are you going to do now?" she asked quietly, her voice calm but edged with the power of someone who had already won the battle of spirits. Mark looked away, blinking rapidly, swallowed hard. His hand instinctively moved near his holster. A reflex, a plea for reclaiming control through force. But the presence of others, the growing crowd, and the cameras held him in checkpoint. One of the younger officers who had arrived earlier stepped forward, his face a mixture of uncertainty and duty. "Sir, please step back. Let's keep this under control," he urged, glancing nervously between Mark and Serena. Mark's shoulders tightened, then sagged slightly. The adrenaline was ebbing, replaced by the creeping dread of accountability. Serena remained silent, but the strength radiating from her was palpable. She did not demand justice, did not call out. Her mere presence was an unspoken indictment. The bystanders, once passive, now whispered urgently, some recording with renewed fervor. The moment had crystallized, a raw exposure of abuse, a rupture in the facade of protection that law enforcement claimed to offer. Mark's eyes flicked back to Serena, searching for forgiveness, for a way to rewrite the narrative. But all he found was a woman who had endured the blow without breaking, whose silence spoke louder than any scream. The tension hung in the air like a living thing, fragile, volatile, waiting to snap. Then, without ceremony, Mark sank to one knee on the pavement. The movement was not dramatic, not forced by protocol, but a collapse born from the realization that his authority had been stripped bare in front of the world. His head bowed, hands resting on his thighs, the storm inside him laid bare. Around him, the crowd held its breath, witnessing not the fall of a man, But the shattering of a system long cloaked in silence, Serena stood tall, her gaze unwavering. She said nothing. There was no need. The punch, the blood, the kneeling. These were words far more powerful than any spoken protest. In the midst of the stunned quiet, a breeze stirred fallen leaves, scattering them like whispers of change across the street. This was more than a moment of violence. It was a fracture in the very foundation of unchecked power, and Serena Brooks, with blood on her cheek and fire in her eyes, had become the embodiment of resilience, a silent challenge to a world that too often preferred silence over justice. The street was still, the weight of the moment thick as fog, pressing on every breath, every heartbeat. Serena Brooks, standing tall despite the blood trickling down her cheek, finally reached into her coat pocket with deliberate calm. The movement drew the eyes of the crowd, shifting the tension into sharp focus. From the depths of her jacket, she produced a slim, dark leather wallet, unassuming, yet heavy with significance. Without haste or flourish, she opened it, exposing the gleam of a steel badge, its polished surface catching the afternoon sun. The engraving read, Chief Inspector, Division of Internal Affairs, State of Vermont. A ripple ran through the gathered onlookers, a collective intake of breath like a wave crashing over the silent crowd. Whispers blossomed into murmurs. She's the chief. Mark Dalton's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat as realization dawned with crushing clarity. The very woman he had struck, the one he had sought to intimidate, was not just any stranger. She was his superior, the Internal Affairs Chief himself, the person whose authority towered over his own, the embodiment of the very system he thought he controlled. His knees buckled without conscious will, and he sank to the pavement with a thud that echoed louder than the punch itself. It wasn't guilt that brought him down. It was fear, raw and unfiltered. The sharp sting of losing control in a moment where power flipped like a switch. Around him, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The balance of dominance, once so unyieldingly in Mark's favor, dissolved into dust beneath Serena's steady gaze. The crowd's whispers grew into stunned silence as they watched the man who had wielded a fist with impunity now kneeling, unarmed, diminished. Serena's voice cut through the stillness, quiet but resolute. You've made a grave mistake, Mark. His name hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Mark's hands trembled as he placed them on his thighs, head bowed low. He was no longer the officer demanding compliance. He was a man stripped bare by his own actions, a figure broken not by force, but by the revelation of truth. The surrounding crowd's eyes darted between Serena's badge and Mark's kneeling form, a silent acknowledgement of a power dynamic reversed. The man who had assumed dominance was now a shadow beneath the authority he once scorned. A woman in the crowd whispered to her companion. He didn't know who she was. The companion nodded, eyes wide, disbelief mingling with a dawning understanding of the deeper currents beneath what had unfolded. Serena folded her badge back into its wallet and closed it with quiet precision. She didn't need to shout her rank or assert her authority. The weight of her presence spoke volumes. Her calm, composed demeanor was the final punctuation on the scene, a reminder that true power need not roar to be felt. Mark's lips parted, but no words came. The facade of control shattered, replaced by the raw exposure of a man confronted with the consequences of his own unchecked aggression. The younger officers who had arrived earlier exchanged uncertain glances. Their leader had just been unmasked, humbled in the most public and undeniable way. It was a moment none would forget. Serena took a step forward, the crowd instinctively stepping back, clearing a path that was both literal and symbolic. She looked down at Mark with eyes that held neither hatred nor triumph, but a solemn expectation. This isn't just about a single incident, she said softly. It's about the system we all serve, and the accountability we owe to those it protects. Mark remained kneeling, the weight of those words settling over him like a shroud. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing the gravity of a shift far beyond the punch or the street. Here was a reckoning, raw, unavoidable, and profound. Serena glanced briefly at the faces surrounding them. Witnesses, bystanders, officers, each holding a piece of the moment's significance. Then, without another word, she turned away, her silhouette steady and unyielding as she walked toward her vehicle. Mark did not rise. Not yet. Not while the truth still held him captive in its unwavering gaze. The street remained hushed, the echoes of the reveal settling like dust in the fading light, and in that silence, something unspoken passed through the crowd. A reminder that power, when wielded without conscience, is fragile, and that sometimes the quiet authority of one unwavering individual can bring an entire system to its knees. The quiet that followed Serena Brooks' reveal lingered only briefly before the world around her erupted. The streets, once still with tension, now buzzed with murmurs that quickly grew into conversations, discussions, and soon, undeniable uproar. The punch, the badge, the kneeling, every element of that charged moment had ignited a fire far larger than the small town where it unfolded. Officers and townsfolk alike began to share their perspectives, their voices mixing in an uneasy chorus of shock, denial, and reluctant admission. Among the police ranks, whispers spread like wildfire. Mark Dalton's actions could no longer be ignored, nor could the long shadows cast by his past behavior. It wasn't long before surveillance footage surfaced. From the police department's own cameras to bystanders' cell phones, videos multiplied, each capturing Mark's aggressive demeanor, the cold escalation, and finally, the devastating punch. The clips circulated rapidly across social media platforms, turning a local incident into a viral sensation. Public outrage surged. Questions flooded in. How had this man remained on the force? Why had his misconduct been overlooked or dismissed? The answers pointed to a systemic rot, a culture of silence and complicity that had allowed Mark's behavior to fester unchecked. Behind closed doors, the department scrambled. An internal investigation was launched, ostensibly to restore order, but also to confront the uncomfortable truths that had emerged. The investigators pored over Mark's personnel files and disciplinary records, documents revealing a trail of complaints, warnings, and incidents too numerous to dismiss as anomalies. Each record painted a troubling picture. Racial bias, excessive force, intimidation tactics, patterns repeated over years yet met with muted responses. Investigations that stalled. Complaints quietly buried. Supervisors who turned blind eyes. The culture that tolerated, even enabled, such misconduct was now under a harsh spotlight. This reckoning took on a name. The Brooks Effect, a testament to Serena's silent strength that had shattered the illusion of immunity. Her refusal to bow, her steadfast calm in the face of aggression, forced the department and the public to confront the reality long denied. The effect rippled beyond Mark's case, triggering waves of testimonies from officers and civilians alike who had witnessed similar abuses but remained silent. Their voices, once muffled by fear or apathy, now found courage in the tide of exposure. In internal meetings, the weight of complicity was acknowledged with rare candor. Leadership grappled with how deep the problem ran, recognizing that fixing one officer would not heal the fractures in the entire system. New protocols were discussed, including independent oversight and stricter vetting processes for promotions, steps toward transparency, but far from a cure-all. Meanwhile, the community watched closely, wary yet hopeful. The Brooks Effect had awakened a collective awareness, a demand for accountability that transcended headlines. The incident became a catalyst not just for change, but for an honest reckoning with the culture that had allowed injustice to flourish. As the investigation unfolded, Mark Dalton faced suspension and pending charges, but more importantly, his fall symbolized the cost of unchecked prejudice within the force. His case was a mirror held up to the department, reflecting not just individual failings but institutional flaws. Serena Brooks herself remained a figure both revered and enigmatic. She offered no public statements, no calls for applause. Her silence a deliberate power, a reminder that change begins not with noise, but with steadfast resolve. The name Brooks became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance and integrity that challenged the police force to do better, to be better. It inspired discussions in training rooms and town halls, in social media feeds and quiet conversations, sparking a movement that demanded more than promises. In the months that followed, the department saw unprecedented scrutiny. Ethics boards convened, policies rewritten, and a culture of accountability tentatively took root. The Brooks effect had opened a door long sealed, a door through which justice, though slow and uneven, began to pass, and in that passage, the small town where it all began was forever changed. No longer a quiet backdrop to overlooked abuses, it had become a beacon, a reminder that even the quietest resistance can expose the loudest truths, and that silence broken at the right moment can shatter the strongest walls. In the days that followed the storm of outrage, Serena Brooks remained conspicuously absent from the media spotlight. Unlike the typical narrative of public figures seizing moments of controversy to raise their voices, she chose a path defined not by loud declarations, but by deliberate, composed silence. She filed a formal report with the state's Internal Affairs Department, concise, thorough, and unyielding in its clarity. The document laid bare the facts, leaving no room for misinterpretation or obfuscation. Yet, when approached by journalists seeking interviews or public statements, Serena declined. She did not seek headlines or applause. Her silence was her statement, a powerful assertion that sometimes the quietest voice carries the greatest weight. This refusal to engage with the media was not a retreat, but a strategic choice. Serena understood that true change did not come from the fleeting spotlight of scandal, but from sustained, collective action. Her calm resilience sparked a ripple effect. Officers within the force and citizens beyond its walls found renewed courage to speak up, to break long-held silences, and to demand accountability from a system that had too often protected the wrong. Conversations ignited in precincts, community centers, and online forums. Her example showed that resistance need not roar to be heard, could be quiet, steadfast, and deeply personal. People began to share their own stories, no longer fearing retaliation or dismissal. The Brooks effect became more than a moment. It evolved into a movement, challenging the culture of complicity and inspiring reform. In response to the public outcry and internal pressure, the police department undertook a series of reforms. Vetting processes were overhauled to identify patterns of bias and misconduct earlier. Training programs incorporated lessons on implicit bias, de-escalation, and community engagement. Independent oversight bodies were empowered to investigate complaints without interference. The steps were gradual, sometimes contentious, but undeniable progress was underway. Serena's legacy, however, was not just in policy changes or disciplinary actions. It lived in the spirit of resilience she embodied, an unbroken will to stand tall in the face of injustice, a refusal to let violence silence the truth. Her story became a symbol of the power inherent in silent resistance, a beacon for those who understood that sometimes the most profound strength lies in enduring without yielding. Quietly, Serena left the town where the incident had unfolded. She did not seek recognition or reward. Instead, she returned to the work that had always defined her, ensuring justice from within the system, holding it accountable one case at a time. Yet, the mark she left behind was indelible. Communities began to see that accountability was not just a buzzword, but a living, breathing process that required vigilance and courage from all. Officers who once felt isolated found solidarity. Citizens gained faith that change was possible. And through it all, the echo of Serena's silence reminded everyone that sometimes, standing firm without a single shout can shake the foundations of power. To our viewers, Serena's journey is a call to action, reminding us that change begins with courage, that speaking truth is vital, and that strength often comes wrapped in quiet dignity. If her story moved you, if you believe in the power of accountability and the courage to stand, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Here, we share stories that matter, voices that inspire, and moments that remind us why justice is worth fighting for. Thank you for joining us in witnessing Serena Brooks' story. Remember, every subscription, every share, amplifies voices that demand change, and every view brings us closer to a world where justice is not just a promise, but a reality. Stay with us for more powerful stories. Together, we can be the change.